So, I have at this point taught you as much biology as you're going to learn. I can't really teach you all biology again, but what I can do is make sure that you can use your biology knowledge that you have to do the best on the exam, right? So what we're going to talk about today are the strategies that you're going to use in order to pass this exam, and you can probably even pass the exam with a very minimal amount of biology knowledge if you know exactly how to take the exam. We're going to make sure we're going to get all the points that we can and not miss any easy points. Okay? So the first thing that we're going to talk about are FRQ strategies. It's the first section in your handout here. It says general structure. There are 8 total questions on the FRQ. You have 90 minutes to take them. It says a 10-minute reading period plus an 80-minute write period. They no longer do that. They suggest that you look at them for 10 minutes before you start writing, but you can start writing immediately, so you have the full 90 minutes now to write. Okay? It's always laid out the same way. Questions 1 and 2 are worth 10 points. Questions 3, 4, and 5 are worth 4 points, and questions 6, 7, and 8 are worth 3 points. You should adjust your timing accordingly to this, okay? So you can see the questions 6, 7, and 8 being worth 3 points. That's a total of 9 points for questions 6, 7, and 8 total, which is less points than you get for question 1 alone or 2 alone. So if you spent as much time on question 1 as you did on question 6, that was a bad plan. You want to spend at least 3 times more time on question 1 than you do on questions 6, 7, and 8. Okay? What do you do during that reading time, that 10-minute time? Again, you can start writing during the 10-minute time now. However, I still suggest that you do these things. You're going to go through for each question. Make sure that you label the point values. So what does that mean? That means question 1 and 2, you write 10 points next to it. Questions 3, 4, 5, you write 4 points. Questions 6, 7, 8, you write 3 points. It does not say this on the exam. It doesn't say question 1, 10 points, right? So you need to know that that's how many points it's worth. All right. You're going to underline and circle any bold word, right? So we're going to use the descriptions of the bold words that I'm going to teach you to tell how many points that bold word is worth. All right. Then you're going to read questions, make some notes to yourself. Don't make the notes on your official answer sheet. Make the notes on the actual questions, not on the answer areas. Okay? During the writing time, you're going to budget roughly 15 minutes for questions 1 and 2 and 5 minutes for questions 3 through 8. If you do this, at the end, you will have 20 extra minutes to write, right? So you can go back and you can budget extra time to questions that you didn't feel like you answered all the points for. And we're going to go back and we're going to see how do you know whether or not you got all the points for a specific question, okay? Make sure that you are going back and you're checking off all the points from your bold words when you have that part put into your answer. We'll talk about more in a second. We'll talk about that more in a second. Okay? All right. So, 1-part answers. Let's look at last year's AP exam. Okay, so we're going through and we're looking at question 1 from the 2017 AP exam here, and it says, on the axis provided, construct an appropriately labeled graph. All right, so we're going to jump around in this PowerPoint here. Construct an appropriately labeled graph. That is not a 1-part answer, not a 2-part answer, but a multi-part answer. Draw a graph. Right? So, let's see what it wants you to do when you draw a graph. You need to make sure you put the independent variable on the x-axis and the dependent variable on the y-axis. This is for all graphs, right? The next thing they might give you points for is picking what type of graph is correct. The vast majority of the time you're going to have a scatter plot if you're looking at data, but if your data is categorical data, in other words, they say, population A versus population B, or treatment group A versus treatment group B, you can't put A and B on a scatter plot. So what do? You make a bar graph, right? Those are pretty much the 2 types of graphs that you're going to choose from. Scatter plot for numerical values, bar graph for values that are categorical. So let's look at that exam. It says, on the axis provided, construct an appropriately labeled graph to illustrate the effect of caffeine on the probability of bees revisiting a nectar source. Here it is. Okay, so what do we have? Do we have number data or categorical data? Can I graph control? Can I graph caffeine? No. Can I graph, or should I graph one dot on 10 minutes, and then should I take 24 hours and multiply that by 60 and then graph that value and then put numbers in between them? No, I have essentially two times that I measured, 10 minutes and 24 hours. So instead of making a scatter plot where I graph them at 10 minutes and then way down here at 24 hours, I'm going to put just 2 bars, 2 spots on that graph. So I'm going to make a bar graph for this case. Okay? What goes on the x-axis? What goes on the y-axis? What did I change? The time. Right, I changed 10 minutes versus 24 hours. Right, that was down on the x-axis. And then what goes on the y-axis? Nope, not the treatment group. The average probability of revisiting the nectar source. Right, that was the dependent variable. So the x-axis was the independent variable, which was time, and the y-axis was the probability of revisiting the nectar source, or what they call memory here. Yeah.
Will there always be one correct graph to do, or like?
Pretty much, yeah. Okay. All right. So, what else can they give you credit for? For reasonable scales on the x and y axis. That mostly refers to having a bar graph versus having a scatter plot here. But if it's a scatter plot, you would want to make sure that your, let's say your data is between 1 day and 10 days, right? You shouldn't pick your first hash mark, shouldn't be 0 days, then 10 days as your next hash mark, right? Because like where all of those things have to fall within that. So you should do 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way up there. Or at the very least, 0, 5, and 10. So you can make multiple different marks in multiple different places, right? Make sure you have a label on each axis, and that label should have a unit, if there is a unit. Okay, then include a title on the graph. And make sure that, again, those axes are labeled. All right, so given this, again, I wrote these FRQ strategies. I wrote them in 2015, right? I updated them in 2016. Let's go and let's just see, because last year, this is 2017's exam. Let's just see how accurate this is. So we go, and it says, construct a graph. Correctly plotted means on the bar graph or a modified bar graph. Okay, so graph type, bar graph, 1 point. Appropriate labels, units, and scaling. 2nd point, right? Correctly plotted error bars. Ooh, that's different. Why do we need correctly plotted error bars in this specific instance? They gave you the error. They gave you the average probability plus or minus 2 standard errors of the mean. So it says 0.72 plus or minus 0.09. They didn't just put this on here for funsies. Right? They want this to end up on your graph. So you would make your mark at 0.72, then add 0.09 to it and put an error bar up there, and then subtract 0.09 from it, put an error bar down there, and then draw the little line, right? Those are the little eyes that go on the top of your bar graph. Right? Okay. Let's look at part 2 of this. Part 2 says, based on your results, describe the effect. Okay, describe. What does describe mean? Let's go and check out our exam strategies here. We'll go to describe. It says it's a 1-part answer. Describe is only worth 1 point. Okay, so we go back here. It says Based on your results, describe the effect of caffeine on each of the following: short-term memory, long-term memory. So how many points is part B going to be worth? 2 points. One for describing short-term, one for describing long-term. Right? When you do part B and you've described short-term, go ahead and just put a check next to this. I got my 1 point. When you go and do the long term, put a check next to it. It's only worth 1 point, and you know that if you did that thing, if you described it, then you're going to get the point. Okay, because described questions are only worth 1 point. Let's go back and look. Sure enough, describe, 1 point for short term, 1 point for long term. 2 points total for part B. All right. Next part C, was design an experiment. Okay? Now, if you go to the multi-part examples here, multi-part answers, design an experiment is on there. It says many points. Okay? College Board has gotten much better at this. They used to just randomly decide how many points they were going to give you for designing your experiment and randomly decide what they were going to give the points for. They do not do that anymore. If it says design an experiment, there's going to be another part to that problem, another keyword in there. So we go back and see, it says design an experiment, blah, 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 blah. Identify the null hypothesis, an appropriate control treatment, and the predicted results. Okay, so they've got a second bold word in here that says identify the null hypothesis, appropriate control treatment, and predicted results. So when we go back here, what are they going to give you the points for? The control, the null hypothesis, and predicting a result. So this thing, and this thing. They're not going to give points for listing the dependent and independent variable and not giving points for mentioned sampling methods. But these are two things that they could ask you for in those identify sections. But if they don't ask you for them, they're not worth points. Does everybody understand that? Okay. Let's go to explain here. All right, so we're going to control F through this and find and explain. Okay. In a laboratory experiment, explain the ineffectiveness of antibodies for treating estrogen-dependent cancers. All right, so part B only has one key term in it. So how are we supposed to know that part B is actually worth 2 points? Well, you can use a couple cues here. Number one, this is question 8. How many points is question 8 worth total? 3 points total. The first part said describe. How many points is describe worth? 1. So the second part that says explain has to be worth 2 points. When they do an explain, the first point is for something easy, usually something that comes from the question, right? So it says estrogens are small hydrophobic lipid hormones that promote cell division and the development of reproductive structures in mammals. Estrogens passively diffuse through the plasma membrane and bind to their receptor proteins in the cytoplasm of a cell. In a laboratory experiment, researchers generate antibodies that bind to purified estrogen receptors extracted from cells. The researchers use antibodies in an attempt to treat estrogen-dependent cancers, but finds that the treatment is ineffective. Explain the ineffectiveness of antibodies for treating estrogen-dependent cancers. Okay, well, we know there's 2 points that are going to come from this. Where are those 2 points going to come from? The first part here, it says, explain the ineffectiveness of antibodies for treating estrogen-dependent cancers. And it says that estrogens are normally able to passively diffuse through the plasma membrane and bind to the receptor proteins. But in this one, they're just using these antibodies, and the antibodies are going to stop the estrogens from being able to go across the cell. So why is that effective? Or why is that ineffective, rather? It's because the antibodies aren't able to enter the cell, right? And then why can't the antibodies enter the cell? That's the second part. So antibodies will not bind to estrogen receptors if because they're not estrogen, right? Essentially is what this is saying, right? So something simple and then the why behind it. That's what an explanation is always going to be about. Okay? So, justify. It's another really common one. Let's look at justify. Justify. Okay? So here's a justify. Now, this justify, if we go through and look at the FRQ strategy, says it should be worth 2 points. However, there's a little thing down here that says may be paired with a predict. If it's paired with a predict, then each one will be worth 1 point. And you're going to predict some claim and then cite specific evidence. So again, you go back here and you say, all right, here's the predict. Predict whether spraying the fungus will have the greatest short-term impact on the population of stoneflies, caddisflies, or hellgrammites, and then justify your prediction. So why do you think that? We go here. This was question 4. Predict that it was going to have the greatest effect on stoneflies, and then here's why. So predict 1 point, justify 1 point. Sometimes in the question, they will leave out the predict part and only have the justify part, in which case the justify is worth 2 points and the predict part is implied. Okay? With this knowledge, armed with this knowledge, you can very easily read through your answers and check off, this is going to get me a point. This is going to get me a point. This is going to get me a point. If you want to see how to do that, I've posted the 2017 answers, or the me going over the 2017 FRQs, and then me doing exactly that. Okay, I did this, I got this point, I got this point, I got this point, right? So I know that I've gotten all 10 points for question 1. I know that I got all 10 points for question 2. If I wasn't able to make 10 checks, I need to add something to my answer. Okay? Anybody have any questions on this? Let's look at the very end here of the FRQ strategies. Okay? It never hurts to define a term, right? Assume your reader knows nothing. If they ask you about phytochrome, say generally what phytochrome is. Okay? The only time that this can be bad for you is if your definition is, actually this shouldn't say exclusion, this should say contradiction. Contradiction. The only time that that this is bad is if your definition contradicts what your answer was. The only time you lose points on an AP exam, on an AP biology exam, is for contradicting what a previous point said. So, if you said that long day plants will flower in the summertime, right? And then you say that long day plants are looking for the time where the days are the shortest and the summertime has the longest days. Well, like, you just contradicted everything that you said. And so none of what you said means anything because the two statements that you made contradicted each other. Right? So as long as you don't contradict yourself, you're good. All right? You don't have to go in order. Right? You can bounce around, do question 4 and then question 1. However, you should go in order for A, B, C, and D within a question. Right? And the reason for this is because oftentimes your answer for C is going to be based on your answer for B. And so you need to have thought through answer choice B first, or answer B first. All right? If you have a multiple answer question where it asks you to list 3 properties, stop after you list 3 properties. Don't list 8 because they're just going to read the first 3 anyways and then ignore the ones after that. They can only read the first 3 that you give. Okay? The last point that I'm going to make is a really important point, although I don't really see any of my large offenders in this class, and that is handwriting doesn't count, but it does. Okay? The College Board readers, when they go through and they are trying to grade your exam, they are trying their hardest to read what you've written. Right? It's not like they're going to be like, oh, this person's got crappy handwriting, they fail. Okay? But they are human beings, and they are going to try their best. But a lot of times, if your handwriting is difficult for them to decipher and you're already doing poorly on a question, that's very difficult for them to be like, okay, well, I'm going to search through the unintelligible text here to just see if they have an answer, right? To see if something that they said is right. But if you are actually, writing with a little bit of purpose and taking your time and making your words look nice, then your answer choice or your answers automatically just look better. What's up?
Okay, so for the multiple answer thing, if you list 4 and then one of your first is incorrect, will they still want the correct one?
They will not. No. So that's exactly what I'm saying. So if they ask you for 3 and you list 4 and your second one is incorrect, you get credit for 1 and 3, and they won't even look at 4. Right? Okay. Some quick stuff on multiple choice strategies. There are 63 questions, 90 minutes total that you get for it. Questions 1 through 58 are your multiple choice questions. 59 through 63 that are actually labeled 121 through 125 are your grid-in questions. You always want to do your grid-in questions first. That's questions 121 through 125. For 2 reasons. Number 1, they're generally the easiest questions on the exam. Remember, all you have to do is, if they give you a formula, use the formula. If they don't give you a formula, find the formula on the formula sheet that you're supposed to use. You don't need to know any biology to do the grid-in questions. The second reason you do the grid-in questions first is because you can't guess them. Guessing A, B, C, D is 25% chance. Guessing a grid-in question is like 1 in a million. Okay? So, you always want to, there's going to be a lot of questions that have long passages. If the question has if the long passage has more than 2 questions associated with it, you need to read that thing in its entirety before you look at it, or before you look at the actual questions. If there is a long passage that's only associated with 1 or 2 questions, it's a good idea to go and read the questions first before you go back and read the passage, because the questions might not even have that much to do with the passage, and you might be able to just pull out that stuff. Non-passage based questions should take no more than 1 minute. If you're hung up on a question for more than 1 minute, bubble in whatever answer you think is best and move on to the next question. You don't have time to spend more than 1 minute per question if it doesn't have a passage, because the passage questions are going to take up more of your time. Never, ever, 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 ever leave an answer choice blank. Don't do it. Okay? 25% chance of getting it right just by bubbling something in. This applies to every class you've ever taken in your life. Hopefully you already know this. Don't leave answer choices blank. Every year on the exam, when I scan everybody's exams at the end of the year, not the AP exam, but the semester exams, there's tons of blank answers. Don't ever do that. That's a terrible plan. Just bubble something in. Okay? Don't stop reading the answer choices. We've taken the one practice exam. You know from that there are these types of questions. Sometimes there's going to be answer choices that are true statements, but they don't apply to the question. So that might not be the best answer. Sometimes there's going to be a question that has multiple correct answers, and you're going to have to pick the one that is the best. Also, sometimes you're going to have bad questions that don't have any answers that are 100% correct, and you're still going to pick the best answer. So some of them will be multiple that are 100% correct, and you pick the one that's 110% correct. And then some of them are going to have none that are 100% correct, and you pick the one that's 90% correct. Don't stop reading your answer choices. On test day, you'll bring a number 2 pencil. You'll bring your own calculator. I said graphing or scientific is fine. Blue or black pen for the FRQs. You'll want to bring a wristwatch. You cannot use this one. No smartwatches at all. Bring an actual old wristwatch. Borrow one from your mom or dad. You can bring a snack. You can bring a water bottle. Those things go underneath your desk. You're allowed to drink the water bottle, I believe, during the exam, although your proctors will tell you if the rules have changed. You can only eat your snack in the time between the FRQ and the multiple choice. Anybody have any questions on that? Don't miss the easy points. You guys know biology.